Marking your shots is really important. But as you've probably noticed, when you make new in and out points, the previous ones go away. So let's talk about how to preserve your mark portion by subclipping your shots. I'm going to go into my 3.3 bin, and then in my master clips bin, I have this clip here, Vince Work for Others. You'll see that it's almost a minute and a half long, but imagine it's an hour and a half long. In fact, the original interview with Vince was over an hour long. So going in and finding the moments that you think you want to include in your program and subclipping those out is a great way to work rather than working with just one large source file. And just so you know, right now I am working with the source monitor and the transcript window side by side. Feel free to check out the previous movie if you need help setting that up. All right, so the first portion I'd like to subclip out is right here. I've never been really big in doing stuff for myself. It has to be bigger than myself. So I'm going to mark that. And we can play in to out, Option K or Control Shift Spacebar on a PC.
I've never been really big in doing stuff for myself. And it has to be bigger than myself.
And I'll go over a few frames to make sure that we get that entire word. And now I'd like to subclip that out. With my source monitor selected, I can come up to Clip and then Make Subclip. That keyboard shortcut is Command U. And here I'm going to name this. So I'm just going to say Vince bigger than myself. And this option here, restrict trims to subclip boundaries, I'm going to make this subclip twice. First, I'm going to not check that. And actually, I'll copy this real quick since I am going to make this twice. And I'll say OK. And then I'm going to make it again, Command or Control U. And this time I will check that. And Vince bigger than myself. This one is going to be restricted so we can tell the difference between them. And I'll say OK. And I'm going to put these two subclips in my subclips bin. You can see that subclips do look a little bit visually different than master clips. Master clips have a straight edge and subclips have a jagged edge. Now, what is this unrestricted, restricted business? Let's go ahead and put these in a sequence so that I can show you. I'll go ahead and just drag these straight into the timeline to create a sequence. And I'm just going to call this subclip practice. Okay. And I'm just going to move these down slightly like so. Okay, let's take a look up at the source clip. We know that there's a little bit of time before the subclip and quite a bit of time after the subclip. And the portion of the clip that we chose not to subclip, everything before and everything after, is called handle. And in the editing process, more specifically in the trimming process, I have access to my handle if I give myself access. So if you come down here, you can see that this first subclip doesn't have little white corners on the edges, and this one does. So here, we haven't actually learned about trimming yet, but I'll show you that to trim a clip, I can just click on the edge of it and trim out like that. We're basically reaching into the handle of this shot and adding those frames to my sequence. If I come over to the restricted clip and I try to trim, it doesn't let me. It says, sorry, no handle available, and then I'm not able to perform that trim. And so I say, because having flexibility is usually better in the editing process, I typically do not restrict my borders so that I can trim if I need to. Trimming is such an important part of the process that you want to give yourself that flexibility whenever you can. So the main reason I showed you this is that if you ever accidentally restrict your handles, I just want to show you how to unrestrict them. And it's as simple as just coming to your subclip, right-click and choose Edit Subclip. And there's various things that you can change about your subclip, like where it starts and ends. But here you can see Restrict Trims to Subclip Boundaries is simply a checkbox. So if I uncheck that and I'll say OK, notice that my little white corners disappear, and now I can trim this all day long. Okay, so just a simple demo on why I usually don't like to restrict those boundaries. Then I would simply come back to my source clip, find the next moment that I would want to subclip out. I think this is the next portion that I would like. What motivates me is working with other people. Okay, and then I can just press Command U, and I'll just call this Vince working with others. Don't restrict the trims. Okay, and on we go. All right, so I'm going to go through my interview and find the moments that I would like to preserve as subclips to help me build my story. We know that once we've marked our shots, we're ready to start building our sequence. And there are a few ways that you can start sequences. And the first one is something we've been doing so far, which is just dragging and dropping. I'm going to go into my 3.4 bin, and I have a few subclips here. I could either load these into the source monitor and then drag and drop from the source to the timeline, or you can also just drag and drop straight from the project panel into the timeline like so. And I'm just going to name this. I'm going to call this Demo 1, and I'll put this in my sequence example bin. And this has created a sequence, but what it's also done is dial in my sequence settings. It's given it video and audio properties based on the characteristics of the clips that I have dragged in, most specifically the characteristics of the first clip that I've dragged in. If you ever want to check that, you can come up to the Properties panel and then open this menu here, Edit Sequence Settings, and you can get a sense of what your video and your audio properties are. And this is all completely editable. So if you need to edit anything after the fact, you absolutely can. And this is definitely the easiest way to create a new sequence because Premiere Pro automatically creates that sequence based on the video properties. This means you don't have to predetermine what the video properties are. You just let the software take care of it. Now, there is one caveat here. You want to make sure that the first clip that you drag into the timeline is actually representative of what most of your media actually is. You wouldn't want to grab a low-res SD file of some archival footage and throw it into an otherwise HD project as the first clip. It simply wouldn't match the rest of the majority of the clips in your sequence. So be careful there. But again, if you do need to change your sequence settings after the fact, you absolutely can. Now, another way that you can set up a sequence is to set it up ahead of time. And this is important if the sequence settings absolutely need to be set up in a certain way. So for example, when I go on site to television stations and train them in Premiere Pro, they have very specific settings that they're working at. Let me show you how to do this. You just simply come up to File, New, and then Sequence, or that's Command N or Control N on a PC. And then this opens up the new sequence window, and here's where you can access any of these sequence presets. You can come into the settings panel and dial in any of your video and audio properties. This should look very familiar. We just saw this, and there are other categories as well. This is not a very common requirement for beginners to have to set up a very specific set of settings, so I won't cover it here, but just be aware that you can dial in very specific settings if you need to. A more common thing that happens for beginners is that you bring in a clip into a sequence and Premiere tells you there's a mismatch. So let me show you this. I am going to create a sequence just based on the default settings that are in this window. I'm going to come down here and just call this Demo 2 and OK. And I want to put that in my sequences example bin as well. And let's load that. Oh, it's already loaded. Okay. And then I'm going to grab these clips and then just drag them into this new sequence. And I get this warning, clip mismatch warning. This clip does not match the sequence settings. Do you want to change the sequence to match the clip settings? In this case, it's the first clip that I'm dragging in. So yes, I would absolutely want to change the sequence settings. There are other times where you want to keep the settings as is, but here I'm going to change the sequence settings. And now I've told Premiere that I wanted to change the sequence settings to match my clips. All right, so I've got two sequences open. Let's say that I want to create a sequence. Well, dragging and dropping requires that the timeline is empty, okay? So if I drag and drop these clips into the sequence here, it just adds them to my Demo 2 sequence. That's not what I want. What I want is to create a new sequence. So instead of closing both of these sequences and then dragging and dropping, there is another way to create a sequence that is really quick and easy. I can drag and drop onto this button here, and when I release, it creates a new sequence for me. So I will go ahead and name this Demo 3 and put that in my bin as well. Again, this takes on the video properties of the first clip that you drag in, so make sure that it's representative as well. Another way to do that same thing is to just select your clips, and then instead of dragging and dropping on the new item menu, you just right click and choose New Sequence from Clip. And here it's created my sequence for me, and we'll name this. And you can see that it's loaded it as well. All right, so both this method and this method are really nice when you've got multiple sequences open and dragging and dropping into an empty timeline is not an option. All right, so creating sequences is pretty easy. And most of the time, you're just going to let Premiere set up your settings based on your media of the first clip that you drag in.